And we were going to deploy theater missile defense systems in Japan, what we now call our unsinkable aircraft carrier, where today we have 40,000 US troops deployed. And right next door to Japan, and South Korea, where we have 40,000 US troops deployed, and where Bush is now heating up tensions between the United States and North Korea, we're going to deploy theater missile defense in South Korea, which will only anger the North Korean government even more, making them feel like we are closing in on them and that they must respond by escalating their own military hardware. We're going to deploy theater missile defense 90 miles off the coast of mainland China in Taiwan, which will make China feel like they've got to respond and they've got to go now and build more nuclear missiles to meet this growing threat. You know, after 9/11, I began to look at this whole map of this Asian Pacific region a lot differently. Previously, I was just looking at the coastal region along China's coast, where the United States is talking about deploying these theater missile defense systems. But after 9/11, I now look at China's inland border, an area that we now call Central Asia. We know a lot more about it today. We know that the United States has set up bases now in this Central Asian region. And that, as President Bush has said, we're going to be there a long, long time. And so today we've set up bases in Afghanistan, in Uzbekistan, in Tajikistan, and throughout this region. And come to find out, we now know that this Central Asian region has some of the largest deposits of oil and natural gas in the entire world. Uzbekistan has the largest gold mine in the entire world. So clearly, this response from 9/11 to go to war with Afghanistan and to take over Afghanistan, I would submit to you, is part of a larger geopolitical strategy now underway. What gives me confidence in saying that is that I recently read a book by former National Security Advisor to the Carter administration, a guy by the name of Zbigniew Brzezinski. And the book is called The Grand Chessboard. And in that book, Brzezinski has two very important graphs. One of those graphs shows oil pipelines coming through Afghanistan, taking the oil into ports in the Arabian Sea, where US oil corporations could then move it to Asian Pacific markets that are expanding now and demanding more oil. In fact, we found out that in 1997, the Unocal Corporation, one of their vice presidents, testified before the Congress of the United States, imploring Congress to help put a more compliant government into Afghanistan so that Unocal could then get agreements to build the oil pipelines through that region. And so in Brzezinski's book then, he lays out what he calls two key collision points. That if the United States is going to control the oil and control the markets in this emerging Asian Pacific region, the one collision point is the coastal region along China, where today we're moving to deploy theater missile defense systems. And the other collision point is in the Central Asian region, where today we're setting up bases since 9/11 to supposedly go after terrorists. In the Space Command's other planning document of importance called the Long Range Plan, they lay out their final vision, control not only of the Middle East or the Asian Pacific, but control of literally the entire Earth. With the new technologies underway, the successor to the shuttle that is being worked on today, for example, what they're calling the military space plane, that would fly down from orbit, drop an attack on the Earth, and then go back up into space. And also the space-based laser, what they're calling the Death Star at the Pentagon. The industry magazine Aviation Week and Space Technology recently reported on a Space Command computer war game set in the year 2017. And in that computer war game, it was the US against China, the Reds versus the Blues. And in that computer war game, the Space Command launched a preemptive first strike attack on China. Now, maybe a year or two ago, we would have all laughed at the notion of the United States launching a preemptive first strike attack on anyone. But now we all know that in the George W. Bush administration, preemptive first strike attack is now official doctrine. And so in that computer war game, the United States launched a preemptive first strike attack on China, using as its first weapon the successor to the shuttle, the military space plane that flew down from orbit, dropped an attack on China, and then went back up into orbit again. And then the second attack in that computer war game was none other than the space-based laser. A few years ago, the Congress of the United States asked a congressional staffer by the name of John Collins to write the definitive study. How's this whole thing going to work? And his report to the Congress is a book called Military Space Forces, the Next 50 Years. The interesting thing about the book is that in the foreword of it, the section where people recommend it, it is signed by the likes of Senator John Glenn, former Congressman, now Senator from Florida, Bill Nelson, and other leading politicians. And one of the most interesting things in this book is that the author says, whoever controls the Earth-Moon gravity well will control who gets on and off the planet Earth. He says with US bases on the moon and with armed space stations at the L4 and L5 positions, the United States will be able to essentially control who gets on and off the planet Earth. Now, why would the United States want to control who got on and off the planet Earth? To understand that, we must understand what's really behind the space exploration program of NASA. In another book, written by a NASA scientist this time, called Mining the Sky, Untold Riches from the Asteroids, Comets, and Planets, John Lewis reports that there is gold on the asteroids, there's magnesium and cobalt and uranium on Mars, and there's helium-3 and water on the moon. And he says whoever gets to these planetary bodies and controls them is going to be rich beyond anything ever known. And so today the Mars missions that we're now seeing are really about identifying the soil on the planet, taking samples, and someday in the future, NASA predicts, around 2020 or 2025, they expect to have human mining colonies actually powered with nuclear reactors on the planet of Mars. And NASA has said that when the day comes when the corporations, the aerospace industry, can actually turn profit mining the sky, they're going to privatize the entire operation so that after you, the taxpayers, would have paid all the years of research and development, when the time came to make money, they're going to privatize. And in fact, there's a bill pending in Congress that would make all profits in space tax exempt. But there is one problem. It takes a year to get to Mars. They say so long that an astronaut's body would turn to jello because of space radiation. And so NASA's been looking at ways to get to Mars quicker. And the Bush administration has come up with a new program called the Nuclear Systems Initiative, a $3 billion research and development program to create a whole slew of nuclear projects for the future, including Project Prometheus, a nuclear rocket with nuclear reactors for engines to cut in half the amount of time it takes to get to Mars. And so what we are now witnessing is that NASA and the Department of Energy and the Pentagon are working together to move nuclear power into space. Returning to the book Military Space Forces for a moment, in that book, the author tells Congress that fundamentally none of these plans for space will work without nuclear power. He says nuclear reactors thus remain the only known long-lived compact source able to supply military space forces with the kind of multi-megawatt power they're going to need. Larger versions, he says, of these nuclear reactors could provide power for things like space-based lasers, neutral particle beams, mass drivers, and railguns.